Good evening and welcome to tonight's event about the gods of New York, egotists, idealists, opportunists, and the birth of the modern city, 1986 to 1990, with author Jonathan Mahler and Amor Towles. We are delighted to have you all joining us tonight at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. My name is Jackie Trailis, and I'm a member of the programs team here at SNFL. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, I would like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making programs like this evening's possible. I would also like to remind you that if you don't already have a library card, it is easy to get one by visiting any information desk in this building. Finally, I would like to encourage you to visit NYPL's website and take a look at upcoming 7 Stories Up programs like this one. We would love to have you join us in this space again. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Jonathan Mahler is a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine and the author of the best-selling book, Ladies and Gentlemen, The Bronx is Burning, which was adapted as an ESPN miniseries, and The Challenge, a New York Times notable book. His journalism has received numerous awards and been featured in the Best American Sports Writing. He lives in Brooklyn. Amor Towles is the author of New York Times bestsellers Rules of Civility, A Gentleman in Moscow, The Lincoln Highway, and Table for Two. His novels have collectively sold millions of copies and have been translated into more than 35 languages. Towles lives in Manhattan with his wife and children. Without further ado, please welcome Jonathan and Amor.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. Jonathan, lovely to be here with you.
Thank you so much for doing this, Amor.
This, of course, is what we're here to discuss. This is Jonathan's terrific new book, which really focuses on 4 years in the history of New York City, 1986, 87, 88, and 89, from January 1st of 86 to really January 1st of, I guess, in 1990. Yeah. And it is a book. It is so informative and enthralling. It's thrilling at times. It is dispiriting at times, and very moving. So congratulations on the new book. And I'd like to start by asking you about the origins of the project in a way, because you did The Bronx is Burning almost 20 years ago. That book came out, and really is focused on a single year, right, of 1977?
Yeah.
And so, over the course of that 2 decades, what drew you to deciding that you wanted to revisit New York as a topic, but pick this different moment in time?
Yeah, so it really sort of, it is in many ways a sequel to The Bronx is Burning, though I didn't initially conceive it that way. I kind of got on the idea when, in 2016, at the Times, I was assigned to cover the campaign, the presidential campaign. You'll all remember that was Donald Trump's first presidential campaign. And I was sort of part of a small group of reporters who were doing longer pieces about the candidates. And because of my interest in New York, I gravitated toward like 1980s Trump stories. So sort of through that, I got interested in that period of time. And my editor at Random House suggested maybe writing a book about Trump in the 80s, which I definitely did not want to do. But by that point, I had started to, immerse myself in the 80s in New York, and kind of came to the realization that this was like a fascinating period of time with all these incredible events. And I also kind of saw that this was the logical next chapter after The Bronx is Burning. So if you think about like the history of New York in kind of broad chapters, there's sort of the war and World War II. There's the post-war period when New York was like America's great working class city with, filled with labor unions, working class jobs, shipping and manufacturing. That all kind of disappears over the course of the 60s and 70s, leading to the kind of infamous period of urban blight, white flight, the period of time kind of captured in Taxi Driver and The Warriors, plenty of other pop culture references, and so that was sort of that was the New York that was the Bronx is Burning New York, kind of New York at its nadir. This is kind of what happened next, which was that New York was reborn, and it became a city whose economy was really driven by Wall Street, by finance, and by real estate. So the period of time I'm exploring in this book is the rebirth of New York, but it's like rebirth should almost be in quotation marks, because it's a very complicated rebirth. A lot of people are left out of it, and this is really when New York kind of fractures. So that's sort of the genesis.
Now, for the benefit of those who haven't had a chance to read it yet, can you sort of highlight, because there's a number of dynamics that play out in that period beyond the economic recovery, which, as you say, the Wall Street boom and the real estate boom is one factor. Can you sort of give us a sense of some of those other highlights that you focus on in the book that define that stretch of time?
Yeah. So there is this rebirth, but there is kind of the other side of this rebirth, and so what you see during these years is kind of a degree of racial tension and really racial violence in the city that is almost hard to imagine today. You see really the beginning of the homelessness crisis, which is also kind of hard to wrap your head around. This before the 1980s, there were no homeless people really per se in New York, or maybe the late 70s. There were, what were known as vagrants or winos or drunks hanging around the Bowery, but you didn't have a big population of people living in the street. So that really begins to happen in the 1980s, and this was also a sort of real estate period of real estate, booming real estate, the destruction of the kind of welfare hotels that housed a lot of the kind of poorer New Yorkers. So it was a kind of a complicated period of time. It's also, this was the years of the crack epidemic and sort of soaring crime. And of course, the AIDS epidemic, which was another kind of trauma that the city was living through during these years.
And in the book, Jonathan covers all of that as you're moving through the chronology of these 4-year periods, sort of keeping track of how these enormous forces are ebbing and flowing against the landscape of the city. But now, in the telling of that story, in the describing of those events, and where the title really comes from is because also emerging during this 4-year period are some incredible personalities, or however you want to call them, who rise to prominence and who still have impact on us today in many cases, right? So it's including Trump and Giuliani as examples, but it's also Larry Kramer, who's leading the charge on trying to the fight for AIDS, response to the AIDS crisis. There's
Sharpton.
Sharpton, Al Sharpton, Spike Lee. Right? There are all these figures who become national. So I'd love to sort of dwell for a minute on that group that you portray in the book, because one thing, and this is sort of the Freudian part of this conversation, putting New York City on the couch, as it were. But this group of people, Sharpton, Giuliani, Trump, you could add, Boesky and Milken are a part of the picture as well. Koch, who's the mayor for the entire stretch of time. They are all people who are people of enormous egos. And a lot of the portrayal of this moment in time is depicting how large egos in the context of New York can gain power, authority, influence, wealth, but in this incredible fashion. So I was wondering if you could talk about, why is New York City a town where egos can thrive? And actually, maybe I think I have this written down, something that you wrote. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, open up the page. Here we go. Sorry. Or why don't you go ahead and start? I'll find it.
Yeah, so right, they are the gods. They are the so-called gods: Sharpton, Giuliani, Trump, Sharpton, Spike Lee, Larry Kramer, some others, and obviously the title is meant to be ironic. These are not gods in the Judeo-Christian sense. They're sort of gods in the Greek sense, I think is how I intended it. They are, kind of petty and vengeful and wrathful, but also very powerful. And New York is sort of their Mount Olympus. And I would say what enables that is, both that New York is a very sort of special place where ambition counts for so much, but also the media. You can also look at these guys as tabloid gods, as I often did. They understood And this is where this book in many ways kind of explains how we arrived at this particular moment in history. They all recognized that they could use the tabloids to capture and hold the public's attention, that they could kind of tell stories through the tabloids, and that in a certain sense, it didn't matter whether the tabloids were on any given day making fun of them or celebrating them. And this becomes very clear in particular with Al Sharpton, who was kind of mocked almost daily by the tabloids, but all the while was kind of building support, building his own kind of base of support, and building crowds for his protests. So there was a kind of, I would say it was kind of a combination of kind of just the unique air of New York, the unique atmosphere of New York, this particular period of time, which was so charged in so many ways, where there was so much conflict and there was so much kind of intensity and energy in the city, and really the tabloids, and the fact that our attention. This was a period of time when, before the internet, before cable news, when these three newspapers, these three tabloids, and the New York Times, plus some radio stations, really kind of held the city's attention. So if you could speak to the whole city, and really through the city, the whole world, through these media outlets.
The quote that I was looking for, which relates to this, is your observation that New York at the time was a gladiatorial arena for those with the biggest appetites, the loudest voices, and the most outsized ambitions. Right? That combination somehow. In that moment in time, you could go from nothing to being kind of gathering influence and power and money in some cases.
Yeah.
But so the other side of that is if in your index, this isn't in your index, but if in your index you had the word indicted, it would have included almost everybody that you profile, right? I mean, so because they all end up doing, for one reason or another, right? Milken and Boesky, Sharpton. Giuliani, Trump, Trump, all of them, all these outsized figures ended up, they don't necessarily end up crashing and burning, but they all have major moments of downfall, and often with an indictment attached to it. So is that just the Greek thing playing out all over again? Or is there something special about the New York version that the guys that we push to the top or let rid of the top are the ones who are deeply flawed in terms of either their moral compass or whatever? I don't know.
It's both of those things, and I think it's sort of another quality that all of these guys learned during this period of time, which is shamelessness, really, which is a sense that you can be, it almost, if you act bulletproof, you are bulletproof. It really doesn't matter what happens to you and what people are saying about you. If you just keep going, you're going to be okay. I mean, that's what, as Roy Cohn sort of famously says, never apologize, never admit you were wrong, which, you see, obviously, Trump is of course the obvious example of that, but you see it in Sharpton too during these years, when he's, refuses to acknowledge that he's wrong about the rape of Tawana Brawley, for instance. You see it in Larry Kramer, who's just utterly shameless. I mean, that's truly his brand, and it works. It draws so much attention to the AIDS crisis. So I think that it's sort of all of those things, I would say. Yeah.
As a sort of, this is an aspect of this question, is it occurred to me in reading the book that you have, Bloomberg, Giuliani, de Blasio, New York City mayors, all who run for president, of the United States with great enthusiasm, and all who flame out spectacularly. What is it about New York City that happens, that we choose people to run our town that have that outsized ambition but don't have any chance of actually serving the country at that scale?
And yet there is one New Yorker who did become president.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's I mean, obviously you get delusion. I mean, you certainly used to. Well, you did with de Blasio. You get delusions of grandeur if you're running New York City. It's, you feel like you're just automatically a national and even international figure if you're the mayor of New York, and that certainly was more so the case, 10, 20 years ago. So I mean, I think that's part of it. But obviously, a lot of these guys didn't translate well, and right. yet Trump did. And what's so amazing about Trump is that I think just during my research, I mean, I was constantly running into references to Trump during these years. I mean, the most memorable one was Wayne Barrett, who was the Village Voice, kind of the muckraking Village Voice reporter, who was really the first guy who got onto how corrupt Donald Trump was back in the 1970s. Wrote the first big biography of him, just kind of revealing who he was. And so, during my research, I came across his original book proposal that he sold in the early 1980s for his biography of Donald Trump. And he refers to him even in the book proposal, when he's trying to make a case for a book about Donald Trump, as a fleeting cultural figure. So, it's sort of the thing about, is that every New Yorker seemingly kind of thought they saw through it, but evidently didn't. Yeah. So.
Well, at the same time, you catalog this, and it's a little shocking in rereading it at this stage, is that all of the press spoke pretty highly of him, even when it was quite clear that he wasn't what he claimed to be, that he wasn't doing immoral acts. That now seem quite innocent in the grand scheme, but.
Including the New York Times.
Yeah, the New York Times, Time, whatever, they were all kind of speaking of him very favorable terms.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was I kind of grappled with this a lot with the Times, because I mean, it was so over the top that and particularly the Abe Rosenthal was the editor of the Times during these years.
I had no idea.
He had this great.
It turns out that Trump was a friend of Abe Rosenthal's, and had a very close connection to him that had some influence on the paper and how it treated Trump.
Yeah, I mean, there's in Rosenthal's papers, there's a little internal memo that a reporter wrote to him saying, no wonder this guy has such a huge ego. No one has been on the cover of so many New York Times sections in such a short period of time, and. I think that I would say that trying to understand this, I think that, and we don't have to spend too much time talking about Donald Trump. No one wants to talk about Donald Trump, but I think that he came along at a moment when, in the early '80s, late '70s, when New York was really in the dumps. And I think that a place like the New York Times, to put a generous spin on it, which at the time was much more interested in New York City than it is today. It was a New York institution. Now it's really more of an international institution, national institution. And I think they felt, well, here's a guy who's investing, at least putting some money down and making an investment in New York. And he's, brash and audacious. And these were qualities that, after the 1970s, felt like they were in short supply in New York. So I think that, thinking about this from, generously, I think that was maybe, maybe explains why the Times was, admired him so much during these years.
We've talked about in this sort of this series of in essence rogues that that were so prominent at that time, and that in a way become even more roguish as in the years after this. But can you talk about who, when you went back and you did this work on this period, when you walked away from it, who stood out for you as heroes of the period?
Yeah. I mean, everyone is so complicated, and so I mean, there's really no one in this book who's just I guess a pure hero. I mean, that's not true. There are some sort of smaller.
There's a couple.
Yeah, there are some sort of smaller characters.
Spike Lee comes off pretty well.
Spike Lee definitely.
In the story.
He definitely does. I mean, I guess I would say it's hard now. He's become a little bit of a kind of caricature now, but it's. When you kind of think back and look back on this period of time, I mean, he was doing something incredibly courageous. He was really he also just, I think he was incredibly cool in a way that I think now he's kind of goofy, but at the time there was he was truly rejecting Hollywood to make the movie he wanted to make, to give it the ending he wanted to make. Even as the studio was insisting, he changed it. He refused to, and he was really taking on this moment in the life of New York with a amazing piece of art. So he certainly, and I do write a bit about homeless activists, some various homeless activists who are, were certainly not flawed in the way that the gods were. People who just felt like this was an urgent crisis, and a social and economic crisis that the city was not dealing with and still hasn't.
Can you how about Ward?
Yeah.
How does he stand for you?
Well, I think he's.
Can you tell everybody who he is and
Sure.
what sort of the role he plays in this moment in time?
Yeah. So Benjamin Ward he's totally fascinating figure. He was the police chief during these years. He was New York's first black police commissioner, and he comes along at just like the worst possible moment, just on the eve of the crack epidemic. So here he is, the New York's first black police commissioner, having to deal with this like unprecedented drug epidemic that is like in particular in the black community, and it's driving crime up in the black community as well. So he's like a fascinating guy, and in his papers, which are at John Jay College, I found an unpublished memoir that he had written, which was amazing. It was just like it just gave me kind of such insight. It was like incredibly candid about all of his struggles with Koch and with crime during these years. And he wrote in this really powerful way in this unpublished memoir about just the experience of locking up so many young black men and feeling like feeling horrible about it, but also feeling like he wouldn't do it any other way. I mean, this is what he had to do. And he also was just like had just a sort of fascinating background. He had a his father was Irish, his mother was black. He was one of 12 children who grew up with nothing in Brooklyn. Was a really a brilliant man. So I think he was, and he found himself really alienated by much of the black leadership in the city, who felt that he was kind of insufficiently sympathetic to the economic circumstances that were leading to that were causing crime, that were causing the people to turn to crack, and instead was too law and order. So you see through him this. I mean, it just was. Sort of tragic almost that he's sort of caught between, as it was known at the time, like black and blue, right? Between being a cop and being a member of the black community.
Because he's a very honorable person.
Yeah.
And he's a dedicated public servant. But as you say, the circumstances are such that he's at war with half the constituency at all times.
Exactly.
And the other piece of it, which I'd like you to talk about, is, because we haven't delved into it yet, but is that this moment in time, this 4-year period, and it's incredible how many high-profile violent racial incidents occur that become national news, one after another after another. And so can you sort of talk about that aspect of the era, but then also, Ward inheriting that, or and having to grapple with that problem? Yeah,
and I mean one thing that really kind of I just found so poignant was this is a crazy. It was one of the things that also sort of drew me to this book. Is just I kind of couldn't believe that so many of these events happened within these 4 years. So I mean, I won't go into all the details, but just Howard Beach. Tawana Brawley, the Central Park Five, and then finally the murder of Yusuf Hawkins, who was a black teenager who went with a couple friends into Bensonhurst one night in the summer of August of 1989 to go look at a used car. They're kind of surrounded by a group of white teenagers. They get chased. They think they're just going to get beaten up, but one of these white teenagers pulls out a gun and murders Yusuf Hawkins sort of in cold blood that night. And it's just on the eve of the mayoral race. It becomes a huge political issue. And one Al Sharpton, who is at the time kind of the chief rabble-rouser in the city, decides that he's going to hold a protest, a demonstration, marching through the streets of Bensonhurst, which is a almost exclusively white Italian-American neighborhood. So he organizes a busload of protesters on the next Saturday afternoon, and they drive into Bensonhurst, and they start marching through the streets, and they are the sort of the epithets that are shouted at them are like you can imagine, but you sort of can't imagine it. People are holding up watermelons. It's like, a bride and groom who are getting married come running out of the church to like yell stuff at them. It is, it's absolutely appalling. And Koch, who is running for re-election at this moment, says, like maybe you shouldn't do this. And Benjamin Ward just privately says to him, like, how can you do that? How can you say that if black people can't march through Bensonhurst? Like, what do you want them to do in this moment? Which, I don't know, for me just kind of underscored how this disconnect that even Ward and Koch really admired each other and respected each other, but they just, they could not see eye to eye on an issue like this. Yeah.
And it actually described, it's because it's fascinating, and I'd completely forgotten this, describe Sharpton and Maddox, what they do, what they decide to do as what they're trying in the face, in leading up to the trial. Yeah. What is their ploy to gain influence over the situation from the government? And it's an amazing event.
So that happens a couple years earlier at Howard Beach.
Right, Howard Beach, yeah.
Which is a similar incident. It's a group of black men who's are out on a Saturday night. Their car breaks down. They 3 of them start walking into the closest neighborhood, which happens to be Howard Beach. Also, almost exclusively white neighborhood. They go in to get a slice of pizza someplace. They walk outside, and a crowd of white kids has collected. They get chased by these kids. One of them gets beaten up. One of them gets away. One of them gets chased out onto the parkway and gets run over and killed by car. And so the one who, one of the others, now finds himself kind of, walking around the neighborhood, having been beaten up, and the police see him, and they start to interrogate him, and he tries to explain to them what's just happened. The police then drive him. He happens to actually be the father, the stepfather of the one who's been killed. They drive him to his body, continue to interrogate him. They don't believe his story about the evening.
They assume that he's the assailant.
They assume, or they assume he's up to no good somehow. So eventually he's released at basically at dawn, and Sharpton gets involved again, the rabble rouser. He gets connected with a lawyer, Alton Maddox is his name, and they decide that the only way they are going to get justice in this case, because already the DA and the police have demonstrated that they're not going to treat this thing as it should be treated, is to refuse to cooperate unless the governor, who was Mario Cuomo at the time, appoints an independent prosecutor to handle the case. And so essentially they get involved into a game of chicken with the state of New York.
And they convince the victims that they should not cooperate, and therefore not provide testimony to convict their own assailants. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Which is an incredible.
It
shows you how complex the moment in time was.
Right? Yeah, right. Because it sort of seems counterintuitive on some level, but it becomes a kind of a political tool because Cuomo can't. He knows that he has to bring this case to trial. There's, it's in the tabloids every day. It's putting an enormous amount of political pressure on him, and so they basically force him to the edge, and he appoints a special prosecutor.
They win that round. What was one of the surprising stories that you came across in profiling some of the people of that time?
Yeah, there were. I mean, I was surprised by quite a bit.
Yeah.
I guess one character who I was really knew almost nothing about, and whose story just really kind of blew me away was Billy Boggs, who was a homeless woman who her real name was Joyce Brown, but she went by Billy Boggs because there was an anchor man named Bill Boggs who she was obsessed with, and she lived on by a heating grate on the Upper East Side, and made herself known to residents in the neighborhood, whether she did so by defecating on the sidewalk or literally lighting $5 bills on fire when someone gave her $5, and so she's out there kind of making a bit of a public spectacle of herself, and at the same moment that Ed Koch decides that he's had enough of the mentally ill homeless on the street. And he is going to find a legal loophole that will allow him to hospitalize them against their will, to institutionalize them against their will. His lawyers initially tell him it's not possible. He presses them. They figure out a way to do it. It might not hold up in court, but they're going to give it a try. And Koch decides that Joyce Brown, Billy Boggs, is going to be the first woman he goes out and picks up. But before he gets there, the NYCLU learns that he's planning to do this. They kind of make the rounds across the city and hand out flyers to all of the mentally ill homeless people in the city, saying, if the city comes for you, call this number. So they the police come and pick Joyce Brown up. They put her at Bellevue. They sedate her like times 10. She falls asleep for 24 hours. She wakes up and she pulls that little flyer out of her bag, and she calls the NYCLU, and they proceed to sue the city for her freedom. And she has a commitment hearing, and she initially wins, and all of Koch's lawyers are like, okay, let's just leave this alone. You've lost. But Koch insists, and they appeal. And she becomes a tabloid. She becomes a kind of a god herself. She becomes a tabloid hero herself. She's finally released. She leaves Bellevue. She's on the Donahue Show. She's on 60 Minutes. She goes to give a lecture at Harvard Law School about being a political prisoner. Meanwhile, all of her sisters, who know that she's schizophrenic, who know that this is not going to end well, are basically withholding all of her public assistance checks because they know that she's going to need them. This is going to be a disaster. And sure enough, it's once she falls out of the headlines, she's back in the street.
Yeah, amazing story. In a number of the last 5 of the last 6 questions, the media keeps coming up, right?
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about how the media landscape was changing in the late 80s and how that plays into how then New York is changing as a result of that?
Yeah. So this was like a very unique moment for the media, because this was, 30 years earlier, New York had a dozen newspapers. Most of them had shut down. We still had 3 tabloids: the Daily News, the New York Post, and Newsday, plus, of course, the broadsheet, the New York Times. And this was pre-internet, as I mentioned earlier. This was pre-cable news. So what that meant was that this small group of newspapers had kind of an outsized influence over the city, and that sort of I thought about this a lot while I was working on the book, and it sort of had this kind of amazingly paradoxical effect on the city, I think, particularly because the tabloids, were so important, so influential. They had columnists like Jimmy Breslin, people who were just, whose opinions, they were influencers before the internet. And there was this amazing paradox, I think, that really kind of explains so much of what happened during these years, which is that these tabloids, on the one hand, were just fueling the polarization in the city, because that's sort of what tabloids do. They turn everything into heroes and villains, good guys and bad guys. They're like basically comic books for adults. At the same time, because they were holding the city's attention, they could run with a story like Howard Beach day in and day out, or Tawana Brawley, or Yusuf Hawkins, or whatever it was. And it would be what everyone in New York was talking about for days on end, even weeks on end, in a way that I feel like now, everyone's attention is so fractured, so sort of fragmented by social media, by so many other factors. And so to me, it sort of made this period of time both like intensely polarized, but also there was a sense that that New York was like a single place, that everyone was focused on the same stories, that everyone was kind of focused on the future of the city, even though everyone seemed to disagree about what that future should look like. There was a sense of investment in New York that I think was largely a product of, or at least partly a product of the state of the media.
From your own standpoint, so I mean, you've been a journalist now for, what is it?
Forever. 30 years.
30 years, right?
More.
So can you talk about your process in approaching this work? I mean, I think that at one point you tell us that in the acknowledgments, or that you did something like more than 200 interviews. Yeah. But can you talk about, and never mind the written sources that you're turning to, but so what was your process of approaching this story, and what about being a journalist in at the New York Times for so long do you think has influenced you in the way that you write this book? Is this would one of your New York Times colleagues read this and say, yeah, this sounds like one of my colleagues in some way, or is this totally separate from So anyway, so both process and style. How has your life as a journalist affected this?
Yeah, so I would say in terms of process, this book is kind of a hybrid of the sort of work I do at the Times Magazine and what a conventional, traditional historian would do, which is to say that I think because I'm first and foremost a journalist, my instinct is always to talk to people, to meet with people, or to talk to them on the phone, however it may be. So I think the first thing I did was just talk to as many people as I could who were around during these years, and because of this period of time, it's sort of, there are still a fair number of people. It's sort of history, but it's recent-ish history. A lot of the people who are around Koch are gone, but some are still around. And so at the same time, I was doing all the kind of basic things that a historian would do. I was visiting all the archives, the Koch's papers, as I mentioned, Benjamin Ward's papers, Larry Kramer's archive at Yale, and I was really relying a lot on the contemporaneous accounts of these years. So because this book, really trying to recreate the feel of New York during these years, like nothing is more valuable than the tabloids, than the Village Voice, even Spy Magazine, things that were kind of telling, kind of capturing the mood of the city during these years. In terms of so that's sort of the kind of approach. In terms of the content of the book itself, I think it's in some ways it is sort of similar to a magazine story. I think except it took me 8 years. I would definitely not keep my job if I spent 8 years on a story. I started with this idea that, as I mentioned at the beginning, that I was interested in the 80s in New York. Of course, I can't write a book that's going to cover all of the 1980s in New York. I mean, I could, but I don't want to write a survey history. I sort of gravitate towards kind of character-driven stories that really are at least narrow enough to really recreate a specific moment in time and follow characters through a period of time and changes, all these things that you know about as a novelist. And so I had to sort of, in many ways, as I often do with a magazine story, you have an idea, but you have to find the people who are going to kind of carry your story, and you have to kind of narrow, you have to find the narrative, you have to find the story. So I sort of started with the 80s, and then I kind of moved toward the latter half of the 80s. And this 4 years kind of came into focus for me as the sort of spine of the book because, really largely because of Koch. This was Koch's final term. He was this just like a fascinating kind of outsized figure in New York during these years who was so amazing to write about because his whole identity, his whole brand was, what you see is what you get. Like, I'm out in the street and talking to voters, and you may disagree with me, but I'm not gonna sugarcoat anything. At the same time, he was harboring this incredible secret about his identity, which was that he was gay. So to sort of look back on those years, like kind of with that understanding, just made him just sort of a fascinating person to write about. So and particularly because during these 4 years, he goes from being really one of the most popular mayors in the history of New York. I mean, maybe barring, Fiorello LaGuardia at a certain point in time, but he was enormously popular. To being, just really like cast out by the city that he had, that meant everything to him. So that arc, I felt, watching this all kind of unravel, watching the city unravel and watching it all kind of slip away for Ed Koch over the course of these 4 years felt to me like, okay, that's going to be the kind of heart and soul of the book. And then I will can build everything sort of around that. And then, you just had this kind of, as we've talked about, just this kind of crazy confluence of events that happened during these years, the racial incidents plus AIDS plus crack, that it just felt like, that I could just sort of keep it to these 4 years, this final term, begin with Koch's inauguration, end with, Koch literally moving out of Gracie Mansion at 3 a.m., so that David Dinkins can move in the next day. Yeah.
Have any of the people that you profile reached out to you because of the book?
Yeah, a couple have. So the first, I got an email before the book came out. I mean, I interviewed, everyone I could. And before the email came out, before the book came out, I got an email from Spike Lee. And I had not told him, I spent quite a bit of time with him, but I had not told him like what the title of the book was. So his email just said, "Jonathan, it's Spike. Am I a god of New York?" And I said, "I guess you are." And then about a week after the book came out, I got an email from Al Sharpton, who I had interviewed a number of times up in his office. But I hadn't spoken to him in a while because, the way these things go, it's like I kind of was done with him and I had what I needed and I was still finishing the book. And then, of course, as you know, it's a whole, year plus from the time you turn a manuscript in till the book is published. So I really hadn't talked to him in a while and I had no idea how he was going to react to the book. And his email said something like, "I've read The Gods of New York. I'm in agreement with most of what you wrote." And he said, "Why don't we get together for cigars to discuss it?" So we did that a couple weeks ago. I went up and met him at, Club Macanudo on the Upper East Side. And I was kind of expecting him to just want to kind of litigate everything in the book with me because, I think it's a overall sort of a generous portrait of him, but there's a lot not to like if you're Al Sharpton. And he welcomed me in and sat down. He had a little entourage there. He introduced me to everyone as the author of The Gods of New York. And then he didn't even mention the book and just told Al Sharpton stories for 3 hours about Michael Jackson, Johnny Cochran, Barack Obama, and on and on and on. Yeah, and that was it. And then we said goodbye, and yeah.
So we're about to turn to give you guys a chance to ask questions, but so before that, I want to do a quick run with you. What I have here is 5 quotes about New York that I want you to weigh in on, in essence, true or false, or you can elaborate.
Okay.
I was going to make you see if you could guess who they said them, but I'm not going to do that. So let's start with Tom Wolfe. He says, "One belongs to New York instantly. One belongs to it as much in 5 minutes as in 5 years."
No, I don't think so.
So how long does it take for you? And for you, in your eyes, how long does it take to become a New Yorker?
I mean, I don't. I guess I would say. I mean, being a New Yorker is to me is really a frame of mind, right? It's not just living in New York. It's it's caring about New York. It's loving New York. Mario Cuomo once called the New York idea, the notion that this is a crazy place filled with so many different people. It's an impossible place to live, but it's also a great place to live. And so to me, it's sort of the idea of being a New Yorker is more. It's like a state of mind. I don't know. I guess it's like Tom Wolfe's shtick was always, that there was something almost hormonal about you come to New York and you just you want to get to the top of the ladder. You want to it's the city of ambition, as he called it. So I don't know. I guess it's sort of not surprising that he would have that reaction. Yeah.
Okay. So here's Joan Didion. I still believed, she taught describing being here in her 20s. "I still believed in possibilities then, still had the sense so peculiar to New York that something extraordinary would happen any minute, any day, any month."
Yes,
right?
That is it. I mean, that's the greatness of New York,
yes.
right? Yeah, it's a yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Evelyn Waugh. "In New York, there is a neurosis in the air, which the inhabitants mistake for energy."
That's tricky. Yeah. I mean, it's partly partly true.
Yeah. It's pretty close. Here's John Updike. "The true New Yorker secretly believes that people living anywhere else have to be, in some sense, kidding."
Okay, yes. Yeah. That's an easy one.
Okay, last one. Woody Allen. "There is no question that there is an unseen world. The problem is, how far is it from Midtown, and how late is it open?"
Perfect. Yeah.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, we'd love to open the floor for questions for Jonathan.
We do have mics coming around just so we can hear everybody's questions.
There's a hand in the back row there.
Oh, yeah? Oh, sorry, I didn't see you.
I'm just going to start, so this isn't going to be very heavy, but I just wanted to say I think you're an amazing writer, and I love The Bronx is Burning, and I love it when you write about something that I really don't care about, but I read it anyway because you're such a good, clear writer, so thank you for that. And the title, I haven't read the book yet. I love the cover page, and I'm just wondering to what extent you immerse yourself in like the visual culture and the music of the 80s, and what inspired you while you were writing the book?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely, rewatched Do the Right Thing several times. I actually made at the Times, we have there's like this weekly pop music newsletter called The Amplifier, which is like a sort of a playlist with some kind of exposition, with some explanation, a theme. And I actually made an Amplifier playlist for the Gods of New York, which is basically all kind of hip hop from the 80s. A lot of it's Public Enemy, but not all of it. So that the one thing I would just encourage everyone to do, is to watch the Fight the Power video when you get home tonight on YouTube. It's couldn't be easier to find. It's incredible. I mean, it's an amazing song. It is so evokes this moment and the city and Brooklyn. If you don't remember it, maybe some of you might be able to just kind of conjure it up, but Spike Lee actually directed it for Public Enemy, and the conceit of it is a protest march through Bed-Stuy. Bed-Stuy is where Do the Right Thing was filmed, and so like you get the whole band, like the whole group, all the guys are dancing and singing, and there is a huge crowd of people out in the streets of Bed-Stuy, and then they marched all the way to the street where the single block where the whole movie was filmed in Bed-Stuy, and it's just like, it's amazing. So I would say that I can't even tell you how many times I watched that video, just because anytime I was like feeling dejected or feeling like this is not interesting, this is not an exciting period of time, that just like instant inspiration. It's amazing.
Didn't Tawana?
She makes, yes.
She shows up, right?
She shows up. She makes a cameo in it.
Tawana Briley shows up. That's amazing. Yeah. Okay. We're in the front row here.
I haven't read the book, but I'm curious. To what degree do you see yourself as a documentarian, and the story just told itself? And to what degree did you feel you needed to editorialize or enhance the story to make it cohesive and tell the story of the characters? Because obviously you can't be there for every discussion that took place. Or
Yeah. I mean, I think I tried to. First of all, I tried to do as little kind of editorializing as possible. I mean, there are themes, there are ideas kind of embedded and baked into the story, but I really tried to just stick with the showing rather than the telling. And in terms of the kind of recreating that period of time, I mean, it's sort of. It's something that's sort of what I spent most of my time trying to do, just figuring out how to capture a scene, how to sort of paint a portrait of a character, and it's sort of something I do like kind of regularly at the magazine, but to do it, it's very different to do it over the course of a book where you're introducing a character and following them over the course of your 4 years. So I guess that is like to me more than anything, I really didn't want this book to feel like a survey history, like this is like the history of 4 years in the life of New York. I wanted this to be just a fully character driven, to feel novelistic, really, and so that's what I spent most of my time trying to do. I sort of describe it sometimes like half in jest as like the nonfiction bonfire of the vanities, but I like want it to feel as novelistic in a way as Bonfire.
So I have read the book, and one of my takeaways was that it felt like the sort of early DNA for the moment that we're all in, right? That you talked about the shamelessness and
using the media to kind of control attention. And I was wondering if, in being immersed in it for so long and sort of connecting the dots from there to now, if it gave you any ideas about sort of what the avenue out of this is, or if it's just a sort of continually devolving spiral that started here and is just going to eventually encompass the whole world.
Oh, I wish I had a good answer to that question. I mean, I think it's so. It definitely. Someone asked me once, would your portrait of Donald Trump have been different, like if he had never become president? Would you look at him differently during these years? And I feel like yes and no, because it's this is who he was during these years. But I think understanding, like with our current lens, you can sort of see, and true of Giuliani too, that these qualities that these guys have, which seem, they're ambitious, they're venal, they're greedy, but they seem like you can't imagine that these things are gonna like have this kind of staying power. I don't know. I mean, it's a great mystery. I don't know. Sorry. I'll think about it.
I have some questions about the economic recovery that New York City made in the 1980s. And I want to know, what would you attribute to that economic recovery? Like, how much of it has to do with Ed Koch? How much of it has to do with Mario Cuomo? How much of it has to do with the Reagan administration?
Yeah, I would say Reagan and Koch above all. I mean, I think that the city made a decision something needed to be done, right? The city's future was not in manufacturing. That was over, and so I think that a few things kind of happened in the same moment, and one was Reagan in 1980 and massive deregulation and tax cuts, which kind of got capital flowing and sent the stock market up. And you also had the kind of rise of new technologies that enabled people to sort of trade faster and trade larger quantities and trade globally. So Wall Street is sort of rising. And then you had this kind of new understanding of the real estate of New York, which, for years before this, the business community in New York had said, we are underutilizing the real estate in this city, that we can maximize, we can squeeze a lot more profit out of real estate in New York. So you also had this kind of changing understanding of how you could use real estate in New York to not just to house people, but to generate revenues as kind of assets, as investment. I don't use the word neoliberalism in the book, kind of deliberately, but I think this was kind of the birth of neoliberalism, this idea that, if we can get the sort of private market, private industry kind of moving, we can, everyone will benefit. And so that, I think that Koch sort of believed in that, but he was also sort of playing the hand he was dealt, I think, during these years. And I think the city needed to do something. It needed to sort of reinvent itself, and this is how it did it. I have one thought. I'm going to come back to that question. Does that sort of get? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that was inevitable. I don't think it was inevitable that the city would kind of give itself over so kind of wholesale to real estate development and to finance. And I mean, I think that even in more recent years, like, more effort has been made to try to encourage manufacturing, the rebirth of manufacturing in New York. I think that it was to a degree inevitable, but I think that the scale of it was possibly not. Okay, I'm going to say I have one thought about that. This is not intended to be political at all. It really isn't. But I think you can sort of look at this political moment we're having in New York right now and the rise of Zoran. And again, this is not a political statement from me, as in some ways, like, as an answer to, like, what's the way out of this. I think someone might make the argument that he is that the reason why he is kind of building so much momentum in New York, and really outside New York, is that he is pointing a way out of this, a way somewhere else, which we kind of haven't seen in a really long time. So, I have no idea, where this goes, and whether it's, whether he gets elected and whether New York and the country is better for or worse for it. But I think if you're looking for, I think that a lot of people who are supporting him would say that he's the answer to this moment. That in some ways that New York might be beginning a new chapter now. That one chapter began in the 1980s, and possibly in 2025, a new chapter is going to begin, or 2026.
We can take one more. Sir.
Thank you. Very much enjoying your book. Of the figures you portray, looking at them now, are there any who have evolved in a way that surprised you?
Yeah, yes. I think even though Giuliani in some ways is just yeah, you'd have to say if there were a poly market, in the 1980s, they would have, the odds would have been best betting on Trump becoming president ever. But the Giuliani arc is in some ways just kind of absolutely shocking to me, that a guy whose whole brand was moral righteousness, who made such a big deal out of the fact that he was going to become a priest, but he decided to become a prosecutor instead, that guy would become so kind of morally bankrupt. It's like that in particular, and so greedy. It's so it's just like that arc is just like, you can't. It's almost like you couldn't write it in a novel because it just wouldn't be believable. And then I think there's Sharpton's trajectory is interesting because he's someone who was just widely ridiculed. No one in I should say really in kind of in the white establishment, the establishment media, people did not take him seriously during these years. But he was building a strong power base in his own community, and the idea that this guy who was weighed 300 pounds and wore tracksuits and made a crazy spectacle of himself day in and day out, would become such an influential figure in our politics. And he really is. He was in the Obama White House constantly. Still to this day, so many, when I was with him, this was off the record, but I'm sure I can repeat it now anyway. Someone from Kathy Hochul's office called him because she had said something that was perceived as potentially offensive to the black community, to a black audience, and they needed his help. This is he's the guy who everyone goes to, and that is kind of an amazing arc too when you consider how what a sort of pariah he was in a way. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming tonight, and thanks, Jonathan Mahler. Another great book.
Thank you, Amor. You were great.